said before we started recording, you have a bit more familiarity with Governor Walz than the average American. You are the House Minority Leader for the Minnesota legislature. So I want to ask, start with a very broad question. What is it like as a Republican to work with Governor Walz, who is a Democrat?
Well, thank you for the question. And I would say that Governor Walz, when he came in the 2019 session, he had campaigned up until that point on one Minnesota. And so we were working under divided government. In the House, the Republicans were in the minority. The Senate was held by Democrat majority, or I'm sorry, flipped the other way. Democrat majority in the House, Republican controlled Senate. And so we were looking at divided government. Campaigning on one Minnesota was very hopeful. We kind of all looked at that as a way to work together. What we discovered, though, is that it wasn't going to be like that. Through the first two sessions of divided government, it was very difficult. As I came in as leader in 2023, it was a full Democrat controlled state. And I would say that Governor Walz did not want to work with Republicans.
What exactly does that mean? Can you explain or give some examples of of how that manifested in your experience?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, there were a couple of issues that were facing Minnesota, specifically nursing home funding. We had nursing homes that were underfunded that were closing. And so, as a new leader, the governor had invited the four legislative leaders to his residence for breakfast early in January. And so that conversation came up. My question was, could we look at nursing home funding and fixes earlier instead of waiting till the end of session? And he seemed very open to that. I was hopeful. That is not how the session played out. And as we got toward the end of May, toward the end of session, it looked like nothing was going to happen. So I reached out to his office and I said, this was a concern that we had. It seemed like we could have conversations. That hasn't taken place. Could I make an appointment with the governor? Made that appointment. It went from an in-person 15-minute meeting or 10-minute meeting to an online meeting. And then when I did get on that call, he was nowhere in the room. So he wouldn't even give 10 minutes on a topic that we had talked about of importance to one of the legislative leaders, me, and he wouldn't even give that time. We could have rescheduled, but it just seemed like he was shifting that off. And so that was a surprise. I had never reached out to his office before individually. That was a little bit of a surprise. Fast forward to the end of the 24 session. And as we kind of came to a close, there was a 1,400-page bill that was passed in the House and the Senate within 10 minutes, right before the end of the legislative session. That bill was not available in print. That bill was not available on the Revisor website, yet the governor went ahead and signed that. Completely partisan. The negotiations around the end of session fell off. It was not meaningful. And it really seemed like when Republican votes weren't needed, and it's important to notice that the majority held by the Democrats in the state of Minnesota is very narrow. One person in the Senate, four members in the House. And so it was a very narrowly held majority, mostly controlled by our larger cities in the metropolitan Minneapolis-St. Paul area and the surrounding, not really spread out to greater Minnesota. I was surprised at his lack of unity and wanting to work together for the betterment of all Minnesotans. It was very partisan, and I was surprised by that.
That's interesting. You mentioned the bill was not available online. Is that a departure from prior Minnesota governors?
Absolutely. There, a number of years ago, under Republican control in the House, there was a very large bill that was passed, but at least it had been vetted at some point and it was available. This was not available in any way. Again, we have in our Constitution a single subject bill law, but yet that wasn't followed. It has been compromised other times, but this was egregious. And the shock that the governor then went ahead and signed that type of a bill into law was absolutely shocking.